All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Savannah. We'll start out with some introductions. So my name is Savannah Durham. I am a senior technical consultant here at Leyton. My background is in chemical engineering. Prior to working here at Leyton, I actually worked for Merck Pharmaceuticals in the development of Gardasil. I've been at Leyton for coming up on 5 years now, assisting companies in the pharmaceutical industry to claim both the R&D tax credit, the orphan drug credit, as well as grant applications and identification of relevant grants. So I'm looking forward to speaking with you all.
Hey everyone, my name is Ben Brissett. I've been with Leyton a little bit less than Savannah, almost 5 years as well though, but I'm a senior financial consultant here at Leyton. I started working on the research and development tax credit, worked on some other credits here like the employee retention credit and now the orphan drug tax credit. My background is in accounting. I have an undergraduate in accounting, my master's in business administration, and I'm currently sitting for the well-loved and dreaded CPA exam. So looking forward to chatting with you guys, and please let us know if you have any questions as we go through this. We'd love to chat more.
Awesome. Well, now to the reason everyone has joined today. So we'll be focusing on the orphan drug tax credit, which is a tax credit that allows companies with orphan drugs to reclaim funds from clinical trials. I'll briefly go over the agenda. Well, a little bit of background on Leyton. Leyton is an international company, so we have over 50,000 clients worldwide. The main product that we work on is the research and development tax credit. However, we have expanded since then to focus on tax credits that companies can benefit from if they're performing research, one of those being the orphan drug credit. So now moving on to the agenda. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give some detail about the rare diseases and why the treatment is incentivized by the orphan drug tax credit. We'll give an overview of the actual orphan drug tax credit, which I'll probably reference as the ODTC just for shorthand. We'll talk about qualification for the ODTC, how the credit is actually calculated, and a little bit more on why the treatment is incentivized. And then we'll compare the orphan drug tax credit and the R&D tax credit, which is the research and development tax credit. And then we'll also exemplify a use case of the orphan drug tax credit so you have a solid example to reference. So Section 1, rare diseases. Why is the government incentivizing this? Rare diseases, as you guys might know or might not know, are essentially something where there's less than 200,000 people in the United States that are affected by the disease. And the development of these drugs or the treatment of these diseases oftentimes costs more in research than it is essentially worth to sell, because there is such a small population of people that actually are affected by the by the rare disease. And so on the left of this slide, you guys will see a few examples of what some of the rare diseases are and what the population is affected, and what that looks like. So just one example, rabies, there's less than a case a year. Stoneman syndrome, there's less than a case per 1 million people. And so in 1983, when the Orphan Drug Act was first created, it was really designed to subsidize these orphan drug development to help treat these rare diseases, because the government recognized that it might not be profitable for businesses to actually work on it. So there's about 8,000 orphan drugs worldwide, and it affects about 400 million people globally, which is a really small portion of the population. But obviously the government wants to make sure that they receive treatment too. So that's really the reasoning behind why the orphan drug credit was created and why it's important for the treatment of rare diseases. So therapies or pharmaceutical agents orphan drugs is essentially any treatment, either a therapy or pharmaceutical agent, that's intended to treat orphan diseases. And as I mentioned, that's less than 200,000 people per year in the US are affected by a rare disease. And actually, an agent can qualify as an orphan drug if there's a population of greater than 200,000 people affected, as long as there's no reasonable expectation that the sales of the drug will be sufficient to offset the cost of developing the drug for the US market. So as I mentioned, these drugs are expensive to manufacture, they're expensive to do research and clinical trials on. So if it's not expected that that drug is going to be profitable, even if the rare disease affects more than 200,000 people in the US, it can still qualify as an orphan drug for the purposes of the FDA.
So a little bit of an overview into the orphan drug designation, kind of running off of what Savannah just said there. The Orphan Drug Act was created back in 1983, and prior to that, there were only 39 orphan drugs that existed at that time. Since then, since 1983 to 2020, there's been over 1,000 new drugs been approved for orphan drug designation. And that's primarily in part due to a lot of these incentives, the Orphan Drug Act, and introducing the tax credit and making it easier for companies to offset some of those expenses because, as she mentioned, it's not profitable to do so without these incentives. The Orphan Drug Tax Credit, though, isn't the only incentive that the FDA and the government has put forward for companies that have orphan drug designation. They do have that 25% federal tax credit, and so of course that's a great starting point. But they also put forward other exclusive marketing, marketing tactics or other kind of incentives in order to make companies want to create these and get these orphan drug designations. So some of these other items are like market exclusivity, which is a 7 year 7 years where no other company can use that same active ingredient in creating a drug. There's waivers of certain user fees. There's regulatory assistance that's only available to companies that are performing and creating orphan drugs. And then also some specific research grants, as Savannah mentioned, stuff that we can help you guys look into, but some specific research grants for orphan product development. And that, as well with the Orphan Drug Tax Credit, is really to help just offset a lot of these high burden, high expenses, high costs that go into these clinical trials in order to get market approval and ultimately start selling these products.
So next we'll talk a little bit about the qualification of the orphan drug credit and what actually allows a company who's producing an orphan drug, who has orphan drug designation, to be eligible to claim the tax credit. So firstly, as I just mentioned, in order to be eligible to claim the orphan drug tax credit, the company must have received an orphan drug designation through the Office of Orphan Products Development, which is a branch of the FDA. So that's pretty straightforward. Once you get that designation, you'll receive a designation letter. And as long as you have the designation letter, you are eligible to claim the orphan drug tax credit. Now, the only expenses that can be used to calculate the orphan drug credit are qualified clinical testing expenses. And this chart or this slide kind of shows a good timeline of when the eligibility for the orphan drug tax credit actually applies. So you are able to claim the credit as soon as you get the orphan drug designation up until you get the new drug application submitted. So in that time period, which is usually around 4 to 5 years of development, there's clinical phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials that you're eligible to use as an expense to calculate the orphan drug tax credit. So only those clinical testing expenses from the time of designation to the time of new drug application are able to be included in the calculation of the credit. And if we look at the next slide, so this shows a comparison of why leveraging both the R&D tax credit and the orphan drug tax credit is useful. Because prior to receiving orphan drug designation, all of that preclinical work, so in vitro testing in animals, all of the product development that's done before you reach clinical trials or before you get that orphan drug designation is eligible to use in the R&D tax credit. So those expenses associated with that research are absolutely applicable to the research and development tax credit. And then when you're in the clinical trial phase, so from phase 1 to phase 3, you can claim the orphan drug tax credit alone, but there also might be some expenses aside from clinical trial expenses that could be claimed under the research and development tax credit. So there's a little bit of an optimization that happens during that clinical research period. And then after you receive the FDA designation, or you get that new drug application submitted and clinical trials have been completed, you're again going to be eligible for the research and development tax credit. So there's about a 4 to 5 year window where the orphan drug tax credit is applicable, whereas the R&D tax credit is applicable throughout all of the research that's being done to get that orphan drug up and running and to get it approved by the FDA, to manufacture it, etc.
So as far as the calculation and claiming of the orphan drug tax credit, it is, I'd say, fairly straightforward to an extent. However, there are some nuances, and as Savannah mentioned, there's a lot of optimization and comparisons with the orphan drug and the research and development tax credit. From the start, the orphan drug tax credit is allowed to include any clinical trial expenses, and the IRS defines clinical trial expenses essentially as the same as qualified research expenses in the sense of the R&D tax credit. So those expenses can include any wages paid to any W-2 employees, any supplies or consumable materials, leased computer or computer like web hosting expenses, as well as any outside contractors or third-party entities that are also working on these projects or on these products. The one thing to note with this is, in comparison to the R&D, is for contractors, you're actually allowed to take them at a full 100%, where in the R&D tax credit, there is a little bit of a cap taking off the top where you're only allowed to take 65% of that expense. And both with contractors and wages, and it's similar with the R&D, is you're allowed not only to include the people who are directly engaged in directly performing activities, but anyone who's supporting or supervising the ongoing activities. They're also allowed to be included at the same percentages, so long as that they're truly doing the work and supporting that ongoing activities. So it kind of expands and can help bring in more expenses rather than just the people who are directly performing the qualified activities or those clinical trials. Another note is, for the orphan drug tax credit, you're potentially allowed to include foreign expenses, where for the R&D credit, it's strictly U.S. only expenses that are paid to employees or contractors that are performing the work on U.S. soil. There's a caveat to this in the orphan drug, where if there's not a sufficient testing population within the U.S., then you are allowed to include some foreign expenses. And that does vary case by case and disease by disease. So it isn't just a hard number that they define as a sufficient population, but it does vary on a case by case depending on the drug.
And it's certainly not uncommon with orphan drugs and rare diseases that there is not a sufficient testing population in the U.S. As I talked about earlier, rare diseases are obviously rare for a reason. So it's very common that a lot of the companies developing orphan drugs are going to have to perform clinical trials outside the United States. So not all the time are foreign expenses going to be able to be included, but definitely it's not uncommon for the orphan drug tax credit.
Another difference between the orphan drug and the R&D is there's no base period calculation. And for anyone who's done the R&D, you know that it's not just looking at the current year that has the expenses. You have to build out a base period, and because it's an incremental increased credit, there's that base period that you have to establish in order to compare the current year expenses to prior years. So the R&D is a little bit more intensive and takes a little bit more time to do, where the orphan drug really just looks at the expenses in, let's say, 2023 only, and doesn't need to build that full prep. Additionally, it is to note that, as with most tax credits, expenses cannot be used towards both the R&D and orphan drug, and so that's why we do the optimization of the two. But that's certainly during the clinical trial expenses, it does make a lot more sense typically to use just to utilize the orphan drug credit, because it typically is much more lucrative. And looking below just at the expense categories, again, we mentioned, wages, supplies, and contractors. You can have lease computer expenses as well, but typically you don't see that as often. But in this example, this company had $250,000 of total orphan clinical trial expenses related to their orphan drug post that designation. The credit comes out to a straight 25% of those expenses. So in that, the total credit is $62,250. It's with that there. In comparison to the R&D, if you had $250,000 in qualified research expenses, we average estimate for that credit to come out between around $25,000. Again, it's a little bit more of a complex calculation because of the base year, but in comparison, the R&D would get you $25,000 when this orphan drug gets you about $63,000. This is also just the form that the orphan drug gets claimed on. It's in Form 8820, something that we'd happy to go over with you guys and kind of explain it. Just wanted to bring it up and let you know, it is just a form that gets filed with your income tax return. But essentially, it just states your orphan drugs, the various expenses, and the credit that you have right on it. So it's something that we can schedule another meeting and go over and also prepare this draft form for you when we do a full study. Just throwing that in there to show that that is how it's ultimately filed for. And then I know we've talked about the comparison of orphan drug and R&D, but just again, kind of to recap and go over that, is the orphan drug is about a 25% tax credit on clinical trial expenses, where the R&D is 10%. And that is really just an estimate because of the incremental credit and the complex base years that you have to look into. For contractors, you can take a full 100% in the orphan drug tax credit, whereas the R&D, you have to reduce them by about a 35% cap, so it's up to only 65%. In the orphan drug credit, you're allowed to include foreign expenses, although there are some parameters that you have to hit. For the research and development, there's never a time that you can include any foreign expenses. And then with the orphan drug, of course, it just requires that orphan drug designation to qualify. There technically isn't a designation that you need to qualify for the R&D tax credit, although you do have to hit different IRS stipulations, like that 4-part test, if anyone's familiar with that. And then when it comes to claiming both the orphan drug and the research and development, expenses that are eligible and allowed to be used for the orphan drug tax credit have to be removed from the R&D tax credit, as previously said. The one difference to that, though, is, let's say in 2023 you did the orphan drug tax credit, so those expenses weren't included in the research credit. For the next year, when you're building out that base period and going into that complex calculation, you actually have to add them back and treat them as if they were research and development tax credits. So it is hard to get the R&D credit when you're doing the orphan drug, or possibly in the years after, because the orphan drug credit expenses, those clinical trial expenses, are going to be included in your base calculation, whereas only the non-clinical expenses or areas outside of orphan drug work that you guys are doing can be included for the R&D tax credit. And again, because it is a comparison of this year expenses to prior years, if you're adding in expenses to your prior year that you don't have in the current year, you're often not going to generate a credit. Some considerations with the two credits. There is a payroll tax credit for the R&D credit. So both of these credits can be utilized as an income tax credit, so to offset any income taxes you have or owe. And if you don't have any, you can go back one year or carry forward up to 20 years into the future. The R&D allows for a payroll tax credit for a company's first 5 years in existence, or first 5 years since since 5 years of having qualified research expenses. So if you're in the onset or early stages of having establishing your company, it may be more beneficial to do the R&D if you want to get a benefit immediately. However, in long term, with those carry forwards, the Orphan Drug Tax Credit and utilizing it as an income tax credit in the future typically outweighs the utilizing the payroll in the current years. And that's kind of it between the considerations of the consideration and coordination between the two. It is something that can get quite complex, and that's why we specialize in both of them. So we're happy to look through both criteria for you, both credits for you guys, and see the best way to optimize your benefit. Again, seeing possibly if the payroll is beneficial or not. But that is only useful for companies within the first 5 years of establishing themselves. And that covers it really from our side on the Orphan Drug Tax Credit, the Orphan Drug designations, and kind of the comparisons between the Orphan Drug and Research and Development. So I'd love to hear if you guys have any questions. Savannah, if there's anything you wanted to add into right now, please be my guest.
No, I think we'll open up the floor in the last 7 or so minutes if there are any questions regarding the Orphan Drug Credit, rare diseases, or the interaction between R&D and the Orphan Drug Credit.